Thank you for tuning in to The Girl in the Wall. The Girl in the Wall is a story podcast that I wrote recently and had some very amazing people help me put together in podcast form. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter Janie. Janie woke up from her dream. Well, woke up from a nightmare to be more specific. Waking up with a startle is never fun. Whatever horrible ideas had been passing through her head dissipated quickly, and her head began filling with real-life worry. It was darker than it should be. Assuming it wasn't a post-apocalyptic sky-scorched sort of warning, or something from her horrifying dream, then it was probably just a power outage. Based on the grayscale morning pouring through the blinds and the coolness of the fall air, she further assumed a rainstorm. Great way to start the morning, she supposed. Little did she know, based on the day ahead, a little darkness and a little rain would pale in comparison to the turbulent events to come. Janie moved to the doorway of the bedroom across from hers. There in the bed slept an angel. Her daughter of 4 years lay sound asleep. The gray morning sky and bluster of the tempest did not disturb her. Content to let her sleep as long as she wanted, Janie went downstairs and began her daily routines. Breakfast today would be something simple, maybe Pop-Tarts or frozen waffles. Cleaning today would be kept minimal. The house wasn't too much of a mess, but having a 4-year-old around always seemed to cause more disarray as the day went on. As she was taking out the silver package of morning pastries, she heard her scream. If you don't have kids and you hear her scream, that's one thing. If you have kids, you can pick your child's voice out of a crowd anywhere, anytime. When she heard the scream, there was a moment of panic, then a flash of action. Up the stairs she went to find Sarah sitting on the edge of her bed, breathing erratically. Quickly questioning and comforting her, Janie found the assumption of a nightmare dissuaded. Sarah explained that a little girl had woken her up. She was staring at a boo-boo on her leg. It had startled Sarah, and when she jumped up, the little girl ran away through the wall. She showed her mom the spot on the wall the girl ran through, but neither of them could find any evidence of the encounter. The morning, already going topsy-turvy, just added to the stress of the situation, and Janie decided simply to move on and go for breakfast rather than tackle imaginary friends this early in the morning. After breakfast, Janie went on about her day. Electricity wasn't needed for the daily task like sweeping or putting away laundry. The power had come back on by lunchtime, and Sarah was watching cartoons in the living room. When Janie took the trash out, she saw Mr. Collins, the next-door neighbor, pruning and raking and mowing like normal. The start of autumn had not dissuaded him from his usual painstaking yard work. While Sarah watched her favorite cartoon, no one noticed at the time, but there were 2 children watching the show. On the couch sat the specter of a girl. Without Sarah ever knowing, her new companion enjoyed her morning routine right alongside her. Her mom called to her from the other room, and at that moment, there was again only one child alive or dead in the living room. It was time to go to the store, so Sarah clicked off the TV with the usual electric whirl and went to get ready. The days melted away into the weekend. Sarah and Janie went to the store to pick up various daily sundries and returned home. Turning into the driveway, Janie was almost ran off the road by a passing car. They lived on such a dangerous highway, Janie had to expend a lot of energy making sure her daughter didn't go near the road. She didn't have the means to move them, but she often daydreamed about green yards and white picket fences. However, the reality of transfer trucks and roadkill always crept into those thoughts. Mr. Collins watched the incident intently, and then, when all was deemed well, returned back to his yard. When they got into the house, she put away the various items they had bought. As she performed her grown-up task, her daughter began the kid-related task of making a mess and playing.
Sarah found herself escorting her pony toys around the house. She had given them the elaborate tour of the downstairs thus far, and they seemed to enjoy it, even if their faces kept the same rigid smile as the beginning of the tour. Then, Sarah went to show them the laundry room, and the tour took an odd step. There, in the laundry room, hunched over what appeared to be a dead animal carcass, was the girl from the morning. Stunned by the scene before her, Sarah stood completely still and just observed. The ponies couldn't look away either. The girl was working on the carcass with a thorough manner of someone who had performed this kind of task before. The goal seemed to be the juice inside. She didn't eat or ingest the parts, only moved them around to get out all of the blood. After being watched long enough, even ghosts get that feeling that they are being watched, and inevitably she looked up at Sarah slowly. Red gore and blood dripping from her face and chin, but decidedly more from hunger than sheer feral table manners. Sarah was frozen! She thought about crying out to her mother. She had screamed about this person already, and the blood in the scene immediately horrified her, but her 4-year-old curiosity set in and she just stared. Children are so surprisingly resilient. Sitting there staring at this little girl, all Sarah could think about was how odd it was. After all the initial fight or flight settled into her, she just thought, wow, what is going on here? Sarah looked back at this girl's mouth covered in gore like a 1-year-old enjoying a jar of baby food spaghetti. Moments passed as they both processed the situation slowly, not from being children, but just trying to reach the perspective of the other. Other emotions set in. Sarah looked upon this girl, and part of her thought of her as someone in need. Why was she here eating? Didn't her mom give her a Pop-Tart this morning like mine did? She recognized the kind of animal from the road outside made into road pizza by some truck, and now literally into a pizza by this girl. On the other end of the spectrum, the other girl was thinking.
Not as clearly as she once did, but still could make out the strands of sentience.
Why isn't she screaming like this morning? Would she like to have some of my meal? What if she tries to take it away from me? So, finally the mystery child went from thinking to decision to slow action. She lifted a piece of the carcass out in front of her, dripping blood to the other girl. The juxtaposition of the situation didn't hit Sarah. Her idea was more she give this girl a snack rather than share in the feast of mutilation. All the tension between them broke, and new tension sprang up, as Sarah's mom called for her from the other room.
The ponies just watched as the ethereal little girl went into the wall again.
As she faded through, Sarah looked to the ponies for an explanation. Their faces, stoic as ever, only smiled on. Sarah decided to herself the ponies had the right idea, and she set on a smile and went to see what her mother wanted. Later, she went back to the scene and everything was gone. Every spot of blood, all the sinew and morbid distress had simply vanished. As she tried to process the information as best as a small child could, she walked back through the house. She saw Mr. Collins through the window in the yard with a trash bag heading to his house. Her mother was resting now, reading a book in the living room. How could everyone act so normal? She tried to explain to her mother what happened, but Janie chalked it up to too many late-night movies and a child's wild imagination. The next morning, things settled more into place, and the day went on more routinely. The events of yesterday did stand out in Sarah's mind, but she pushed through regardless. Today they were decorating for fall. Mr. Collins already had haystacks and mums all around. He was always more fastidious when it came to these things. Here and there, Sarah would catch a glance of the girl on the wall, and it seems more common if not still sporadic now. Sometimes she would even stumble upon her just sitting rather than most of the quick movements and hustling away as normal. Sarah talked to her mother about the girl a few times. From Sarah's childish articulation of the events, Janie decided it was an imaginary friend, or too much television.
Sarah would leave things out for the girl, a doll here, a cookie there, in hopes that in some way she could interact with such an odd and undefined entity.
Chapter: Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins lived alone now. Once, he had shared his home with a family. Now he shared it with sewn-up carcasses of animals. His wife left him some time ago. They had 2 daughters, and they moved away with Miss Collins. Mr. Collins knew pain. He knew the power of loss. His family leaving was hard on him, and if you've ever had to send someone away you love, then you know how that feels. Holes you create in yourself are often never filled. Mr. Collins also knew the pain of hunger. If you've never felt hunger, real hunger, you would never know. Mr. Collins' odd appetite of late was the current driving factor in all of his decisions. It was the reason his wife had left. When this all started, he thought it was some sort of obsession that he would move past. Thought it was a phase, but this wasn't a phase. He tried to distract himself with other things. It was the reason he kept his yard so neat. It was the reason his neighbors were gone. It was the reason he collected things from the busy highway. Speculation can be a killer. Accusations and unconfirmed facts can tear people apart. Tore Mr. Collins' family apart. As he worked in his yard, putting things in order, he often remembered his kids playing in the yard. It's better they are gone, I think. he would say to himself. His thirst now was under some control. The animals he fed on helped stem the tide. Each time he stitched up one of them after draining them, he felt better. When he drank the blood, it pacified him for a time. Then it crept back on him like any addiction you could imagine, times 100. Working to stem the tide was an endeavor he worked with. Each day he struggled with not wanting to become a monster, but he knew he was. I mean, what else tore open animals and drank their blood? Only once had it gotten away from him, and he promised himself that it would never happen again. He could see the blood, he could hear the screams. It wouldn't happen again. Not like last time. How many wolves could he find to cover his tracks anyway?
One rainy day, Sarah stumbled upon the apparition girl in her room. The girl from the wall was hunched over and seemed to be silently sobbing. Sarah didn't know how to react to that. Through all of their interactions, she managed a response, but in this, her young mind couldn't land on empathy. What she did land on was comfort. While the girl was crying, she took the ponies and lined them up around her. In her mind, the fence she made closed the girl off from the world. Sarah knew when she felt bad, she didn't always want someone bothering her. She went and sat on the bed and faced away. She sat in silent vigil for a while. When she finally turned to look, the girl was gone. She wondered if she was sad or if what she had done was helping. The pony still stood in defiance, unaware their work was done. Sitting looking out the window one day, the girl on the wall saw Mr. Collins. The memory of him flitted on the outskirts of her shaded mind. She knew him, but she couldn't remember how. As she watched him walk to the road and scoop up the remains of the raccoon, something in her was itching. Her mind wanted to figure it out, but it was fogged over. It was a puzzle missing some of the pieces. She just couldn't see the final picture. She watched Mr. Collins put the carcass in a bag and tie it neatly. He cleaned his hands and made his way towards his home. She wished she had seen the raccoon first.
As it closed in on the holidays, the viewfinder of the world clicked down into a warmer palette. As the leaves died and the fall decorations grew, the warm colors stood in defiance of the cool weather sure to encroach. This day, Janie had decided to put up a few items to make the decor more holiday-specific. On the porch, Janie was preparing to put up a new large scarecrow she had purchased. She wanted it to sway in the day breeze, which was uncharacteristic for a scarecrow, but she liked it nonetheless. Janie got the stepladder out of the kitchen and set it down on the porch. Sarah was sitting on the bottom of the steps playing with her ponies. She was a good helper, but she was also a good kid, sitting and playing while her mother worked. The lunchtime sun had begun its slow descent into the horizon. The cool air blew through Sarah's hair, and she got a cold chill. It took her a bit to realize, though, that not the air, but a sound had given her the chill. She didn't move at first. Her mind searched through sounds to figure out what had happened. Thunk. Thunk would have worked, but onomatopoeia is troublesome sometimes, especially for a young child. Mouth sounds are different than sounds, it would seem. Sarah got up and turned around slowly. She saw her mother lying on the porch floor, limp. Her arms and legs were thrown around, showing she didn't move to stop herself on the way down. Janie had hit her head on the porch rail on the way down before sprawling out on the porch unconscious. The scarecrow lay beside her. No help at all. Her head leaked out blood slowly, a bittersweet mix of life leaving the body and brilliant red to accent the fall theme. Sarah wasn't old enough to fully understand social etiquette. Her lurch and scream and burst into tears actions all meshed together in a childlike novice expression of emotion. Attempting to rouse her mother had no effect. Her tears streaming down her face had no effect. She screamed, and nothing. She screamed again, and that action, that release of fear, rang a small note in the back of her brain. Would my screaming bother Mr. Collins? She had always gotten looks from him when she was in the yard making a lot of noise. He never specifically said anything, but she always figured the high-volume world of a small child didn't exactly coincide with his. She sprang up and moved into action. She immediately thought Mr. Collins could help, and she darted off the porch and towards his yard. As she approached, she ignored the beautifully manicured porch and went straight for the door. Knocking was a polite occurrence, and this situation had superseded any such courtesy. Sarah slung open the door and ran into the house. Entryway? Nothing. Hallway? Nothing. Living room? Nothing. Then another sound. Hardly registering it, she moved toward it into the kitchen. Had she not been full of fear and adrenaline, she would have had another moment to wonder what in the world was making that noise. It was somewhere between pigs eating at a trough and a person eating spaghetti. You would think after the last few weeks and dealing with the supernatural girl eating roadkill that the scene she walked in on wouldn't have had the same effect. There, in the kitchen, on the counter, was Mr. Collins having dinner. Having dinner might have been putting it too lightly. It was more like he was attacking dinner. On the counter lay the carcass of a deer. Hunched up on the counter, Mr. Collins was perched. He had his feet on the counter and his legs bent so he could hover over the carcass. His hands covered in blood and animal, he used it to shove torn parts of the deer into his mouth. His hands were longer, thinner, with sharp fingernails. Sinew hung from his teeth, extruded out of his mouth now, and it elongated his face in a horrible way. He was working through the deer with a meticulous hunger. Then, he had a feeling. That feeling when you know someone's watching you. Late at night, you're in your home, and you get up and close a blind because you just have a feeling. Slowly, his focus switched from the deer he had happily found on the side of the road to the child he unhappily found in his kitchen. There, for a moment, they just took each other in. How had he forgotten to lock the door? Maybe the joy of such a large meal, so fastidious yet so fallible. How could he let her out now that she knew who or what he was? How could he dispose of her and she not tell anyone? Another mess to clean up. And at that moment, she bolted. Apparently, he thought he had more time to function out a decision, but Sarah had less to figure out. It was flight for her, and she made her way through the living room, through the hall, through the door, off the porch, and back to her house. Amazing how sounds registered different now. The sound of something hopping off a counter, and the sound of steps through a house, were frightening in the right context. As she crossed the yard, she heard Mr. Collins bust out of the door after her. She ran up her steps and stopped. There, her mother still lay unconscious. A small pool of blood formed around her head. She went to her, shook her, tried to exclaim the situation that had went from bad to worse so very fast. Mr. Collins came around to the porch in a dash and stopped as he saw the unconscious lady and her daughter there. The sight of blood elicited a response from him, and he began to formulate a new plan. His hunger moved him into action, and he began moving towards the pair. Sarah cried, tears pouring down her face, and all she could muster up was a scream in defiance. The world lurched as she screamed, and she shut her eyes. Then another noise. Noises on this day had been so weird. Most days you know exactly what each noise is, but this thud, this umph somewhere inside a cat screeching with a car crash came through Sarah's ears. When she dared to open her eyes, she took in a terrible situation. There lay the little girl from the wall, as ethereal and odd as ever. Across lay Mr. Collins, now more like Mr. Collins, not the loping, hungry beast from moments ago. Neither moved, and the score of people she wished would wake up and people she didn't had changed. She first went to her mother, who was now breathing steady, seemed more asleep than dead. Then she moved to the girl from the wall. She wasn't sure if she remembered her breathing to begin with, but she wasn't now. She didn't go to Mr. Collins, but she stared at him for a long moment. Normal again, he looked significantly less scary. Janie broke Sarah away from Mr. Collins with a soft groan. She was waking, and joy filled Sarah, and as she turned to move to her, she saw the girl move as well. She went over and helped her up, but she looked broken. Her eyes looked weak and her shoulders sagged as she brought herself upright with the help of Sarah. Janie softly said Sarah's name as she began to remove all of the cotton from her head. Sarah looked back at the girl and they shared another childlike moment. In that moment, the little girl hugged Sarah softly. Their embrace cut short by Janie calling out Sarah again. They looked at each other, and Sarah didn't know it, but this was the last time she would look into her eyes. Sarah's eyes said thank you as she turned away to get to her mother. As she got to Janie, she looked back over her shoulder quick enough to see the girl moving back into the wall slowly. Her mother, now mostly awake, embraced her. A few moments later, her mother noticed Mr. Collins laying across on the porch. She looked at Sarah questioningly. Mr. Collins had a heart attack on the porch and died shortly after. The shock of seeing Janie fallen and the excitement got the better of him. Janie had a bad headache for a while and a lump on her head, but otherwise seemed okay. She threw away that scarecrow. She was glad Sarah had went to get help and was sad over the passing of Mr. Collins. Sarah asked not to go to the funeral service. Mr. Collins' wife was there, but not their daughter. The wife seemed to be there more for confirmation than out of grief. She had Mr. Collins cremated immediately. The secret they kept was put to rest then. She sold the house for pennies. She felt the memories she had there were worth about that. She felt like it was all for the best. Sadness is like luggage sometimes. You just carry it around wherever you go. The new owners of his house threw away all of the taxidermy animals. They found them hideously tacky. They never kept their yard as neat as Mr. Collins had. Sarah had never saw the girl on the wall again after that, but she was glad she had met her. She felt like she had helped the girl move on from the struggle she was having. Sometimes just existing in someone's life can help people. She told the ponies that she hoped that she was in a better place now and didn't have to eat animals off the road. The ponies didn't have a response to that.
This has been The Girl in the Wall. Thank you to Ashleigh and Sierra for your amazing voice acting efforts. Thank you to Mr. Rosewell for the music, Ms. Swink for helping edit, and everyone that I had read this and help me with the story along the way. Please like and subscribe to ST22 Photo. Thank you for listening.